Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to break down a really fascinating randomized clinical trial that asks a pretty compelling question. Can something as simple as a smartwatch actually improve the well-being of physicians? Let's dive in.
Okay, so first, let's set the stage, get some context. Back in 2022, a national survey found that a staggering 63% of U.S. physicians reported at least one symptom of burnout. Just think about that. That's almost 2 out of every 3 doctors.
And this isn't just about individual well-being. It's a massive systemic problem. We're talking about a huge financial hit, too. The cost from physician turnover and, just reduced clinical hours because of burnout, it's estimated to be at least $4.6 billion every single year for the U.S. healthcare system.
But the consequences go way beyond just the money, right? There are multiple studies that show this direct, really troubling link between a physician being burned out and an increase in self-reported medical errors. And what that ultimately means is compromised patient safety. The stakes here are just incredibly high.
So all of this really sets the stage for the big question this study is trying to answer. When you're up against such a massive, system-wide problem, can something focused on just the individual, can it actually move the needle? So the core idea behind the study, the hypothesis, was actually pretty simple and elegant. It was this: what if you gave physicians access to their own physiological data from a smartwatch? Things like their sleep patterns, heart rate, activity levels. The thinking was, maybe that could boost their self-awareness, and that awareness, in turn, could prompt them to take proactive steps to manage their stress, creating this kind of positive feedback loop that ultimately lowers their risk of burnout.
Okay, so to put that hypothesis to the test, the researchers set up a really rigorous randomized clinical trial. And, that's really the gold standard for this kind of research. So let's break down exactly how they structured this thing.
All right, so they got 184 physicians to participate and split them right down the middle into 2 groups of 92. And this part's really important. Both groups were statistically almost identical in terms of age, the hours they worked, and their specialty. This was to make sure they had a fair, apples-to-apples comparison right from the get-go.
Now, the study design itself is actually pretty clever. They used what's called a delayed intervention model. So Arm 1, the intervention group, got a smartwatch immediately, but Arm 2, the control group, had to wait 6 months before they got one. This design is super powerful because 1, it lets you do a direct comparison at that 6-month mark, and 2, it also lets the researchers see if the control group starts to improve once they finally get the watch.
And to actually measure well-being, the researchers didn't just make things up. They used well-established, respected tools like the Maslach Burnout Inventory and the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale. By using these validated scales and collecting data at several points over a full year, they made sure their results would be robust, reliable, and most importantly, meaningful.
Okay, so let's get to the key results. This is really the heart of the paper. Did the smartwatch intervention actually work at that primary 6-month checkpoint?
All right, so if you just look at the raw, unadjusted numbers, you can see a trend pointing in the right direction. The group with the smartwatch had a lower rate of burnout, about 41% compared to just over 50% in the control group. But, and this is a big but, with a p-value of 0.21, that difference wasn't statistically significant, so you can't draw any firm conclusions from that number alone.
But, that raw number rarely tells the whole story. In clinical research, there are always other factors that could be influencing the outcome. So to really isolate the true effect of the smartwatch, the researchers did what's called a multivariable analysis. This basically lets them statistically account for differences in things like baseline burnout scores, demographics, and work hours. And when they do that, we get a much, much clearer picture.
And that brings us to the really crucial number in this whole paper, 0.46. That was the adjusted odds ratio for burnout at that 6-month mark.
So what does that mean? Well, it's a huge finding. An odds ratio of 0.46 translates to a 54% reduction in the odds of experiencing burnout. And with a p-value of 0.046, which is just under that standard threshold of 0.05, we can be pretty confident this result wasn't just a fluke or random chance. This points to a real, measurable effect from the intervention.
The study didn't just look at burnout, though. They also measured resilience, which is basically your ability to bounce back from stress. And here, too, the results were positive. The group with the smartwatch showed a higher average resilience score compared to the control group.
And after they ran the same statistical adjustments, this difference translated to a significant increase of 1.2 points on the resilience scale for the smartwatch users. So that's another statistically significant result, which really reinforces the idea that the intervention was having an impact.
So, okay, we've seen a pretty clear impact on burnout and resilience. But what about other aspects of well-being? And maybe just as important, did these effects stick around? Let's take a look at the secondary and the long-term outcomes.
What's interesting here is that the positive effects seem to be pretty targeted. At that 6-month mark, the smartwatch didn't lead to these broad, across-the-board improvements in well-being. There were no significant changes in quality of life, symptoms of depression, perceived stress, or even sleepiness.
But the long-term data adds another really fascinating layer to this story. For the group that had the watch for the entire year, their quality of life scores actually showed a statistically significant improvement, specifically between the 6-month and 12-month marks. Now, what that suggests is that the benefits might actually build up or even expand over time with continued use.
So after all that, what's the bottom line? When we look at the study design and all the results, what's the main takeaway from this trial?
Well, first, it's always important to acknowledge a study's limitations. And the authors here are very transparent about them. For one, the participants were all volunteers, and the study was done in academic medical centers, so the results might not apply everywhere. It also wasn't blinded, which is just a reality of this kind of study. And we still don't know the exact mechanism, the how behind the improvements. Being upfront about this stuff just reinforces the integrity of the research.
And this quote from the paper really sums up the core conclusion from the authors themselves. They say that wearing a smartwatch and having access to its data may be a worthwhile individual strategy. Notice the wording there. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a cure-all, but it is a promising tool that an individual physician can use.
So what the findings really suggest is a simple, pretty accessible tool for individuals who are trying to navigate an incredibly high-stress profession. But it also leaves us with a final and I think really crucial question. As we start to empower physicians with these individual strategies, what are the systemic solutions that have to go along with them to really, truly address the root causes of this crisis? Because this is a crisis that doesn't just affect doctors, it affects all of us who depend on their care.